We are streaming live on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and on Facebook, as well as recording these audio files for our podcast on Spotify, as well as other platforms too. So I'm really pleased. We've been having some great conversations about humanizing work in terms of both leadership and teams. So we started the series talking about human leadership, what it meant to be a human leader, what could we do now with the latest evidence-based research and practical hints and tips that will make a difference in our current context. And then we led then into exploring what can we do in our teams to help teams be in flow together as they would be in terms of well-being and in performance. So feeling that we are able to work really well together to thrive and flourish in whatever the new ways of working are for us. And we've been working our way through talking about lots of different conditions needed for team flow. We are today talking about platforms and using one of them, in fact. And I'm very, very pleased to have the wonderful Tia Moy joining me this afternoon, to discuss how we can use platforms for helping teams to thrive, specifically in terms of feeling included and feeling belonging. And so I'll just briefly say hello to Tia. Would you like to introduce yourself, Tia?
Hi, Alex. Thank you so much for having me on today. It's a real pleasure. And hello to everybody watching. My name's Tia. I am a psychologist. I specialize in coaching psychology, positive psychology, and organizational psychology. And I'm really pleased to be talking with Alex today about this topic because it's something I'm really passionate about. So diversity and inclusion is something I've been researching. And yeah, really, really keen to sort of get into this conversation and talk about what it means to be inclusive using technology.
And it's a big topic, isn't it? Everyone's talking about it. We've been, hurtled into using digital platforms for everything. And thank goodness they were available. And so many were easy to use, I guess, fairly intuitive so early on. And whilst we had obviously quite a big upheaval for many people learning to switch their work to a virtual environment very quickly with no other options, we've also seen lots of people embrace that and make the most of it. And for many people, it's been a really positive opportunity to change the ways of working and their lives and everything that they do. And so whilst challenging and stretching us in terms of growing into using platforms differently, we've seen a plethora of platforms appear, haven't we? And lots of opportunities to use those positively, particularly with teams, helping to people feel connected. And so, today, I guess I just wanted to explore in a bit more detail, what does that really look like for us now? Because when it first happened, I think most companies found one or two platforms that they like to use and went with those. But actually, over this period of time, over the whole year, I think we're actually inundated now. We're in a situation where I've got so many apps and I've got so many things open on my screen. It's like, which one do I switch between? And there's always something there, isn't there? It's like you are literally always on.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There's so much choice out there. And I think you're right, Alex. It's a good thing and a bad thing because it does, I think for diversity, we do need to think about different people's needs. And on a very base level, we've got accessibility, people perhaps with disabilities or people with neurodiversity might have very clear preferences as to which platforms work best for them. And I think if we go for the most commonly used ones, they're probably safer ones when it comes to those sorts of things. But equally, there's just personal preference comes into it as well. It's like, are you a Facebook instant messenger person or are you a WhatsApp person? Or so there's so much variety. It's hard to keep up sometimes, I think.
Yeah, and particularly in the workplace as well. We still have a choice even at work. We don't have to always use the one thing. And how people, exactly as you said, the preferences people have for how they use those platforms also then changes and duplicates. And, where do we find ourselves? We know that, traditional teams are really changing a lot. We're seeing a lot of teams being thrown together very quickly. with people they've never met before, and having specific tasks to complete together, and the collaboration is critical. And so a lot of our preferences for platforms aren't even considered in that circumstance. It's just, well, what's available? How do we make it work? And some people might not even be aware that people are talking on different platforms outside of the conversations they're having. And so for me, that's a real kind of alarm bells going off for inclusion and feeling a sense of belonging, because people have been isolated. People might get one message ping through and think, oh, isn't that lovely that someone connected to me? And then you speak to someone else and they've been having connections all evening, or they've been doing something else, and they think, oh, well, hang on, I wasn't included in that. Why wasn't I involved? And intentionally or otherwise, there is starting to be, it's almost like that feeling of, what am I included in? Where do I sit in this, social, virtual teams, department, function?
Yeah. There's so many factors there, and absolutely, I think there naturally those kind of groups are going to start to form as they do in the real world. You might get certain people who just connect more with each other, so they're talking more. But I think it can feel a bit like you're being excluded, particularly if you sort of find out about it all of a sudden and you think, oh, I wonder why I'm not being included in this. And I think also it's really important to consider that some people might not even have access to some of these other platforms. So I know that there are, for example, some newer platforms that are only available on iPhone, for example, or if you're in the kind of iMac, iWorld, versus Android. So sometimes it is down to even software compatibility, and have you got the right tech and the hardware to access this piece of software. So many considerations to take into account. But I do think there's two aspects to it. There's that side of it, but then there's also this psychological aspect to it. So psychological safety, I think, is a really important thing to consider when we're doing virtual communication, because what's missing is, when all these teams have been thrown together on virtual platforms, is we're not sort of just walking past someone in the corridor anymore and saying hi, or you're not just bumping into someone in the kitchen while you're grabbing yourself a cup of tea. So there isn't this opportunity to build those informal connections with people. And then potentially it's being dictated even more by what platforms you're hanging out on. So that's a really interesting consideration. And I've read an interesting piece of research about how that's actually a barrier to psychological safety in teams. So it's really important to think about that. How do we proactively build that psychological safety amongst our teams when we are on virtual platforms?
Yeah. And we can do that really proactively, can't we? I mean, we can actually, really think about things in advance. And this is something I've talked about quite a lot with Joshua when we were doing some early workshops around virtual leadership, and thinking about, what we already know about people. A lot of teams did know each other before we were kind of flung into this virtual world. And what do we know about their preferences already in terms of joining in conversations? Do they like to start things off? Do they like to add in jokes throughout? Do they like to sit back and listen and observe before they contribute? And taking that into consideration, using the platforms in the way that we hope it might help support, regardless of what platform it is. I think for me, the big insight over the whole year has been how powerful chat can be in the middle of workshops and conversations. Being able to say to people, let's have a conversation. There's someone here talking whilst you're thinking and listening to what the conversation is. Just share your thoughts in the chat. And so people have got the opportunity to look at other people's contribution, to wait their turn, or to find a voice that maybe they didn't have before. And I thought that's always been quite nice too, seeing people have the strength of voice that perhaps they don't have in a physical environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's so good to just focus on some of the positives from all of this as well, because I think you're right in, when we have face-to-face meetings, I think it's quite brave, isn't it? It's quite brave to kind of speak up or try and sort of interject and get a question in or say something. Whereas when you've got the chat there, it's actually a nice subtle way, and it's not considered rude, if you write a little comment as someone's speaking, and hopefully we'll get this as well as we're doing the live. But it's quite nice actually for the speaker as well to see that, oh, this is what the audience is thinking while I'm talking. And it's a nice way, I think, for people who perhaps are less extrovert or less likely to speak up to contribute in team context and team environments. So absolutely, there's so many benefits to it as well, and having that chat function is definitely a plus.
Mm. And and it also it gives you that time to think, doesn't it? Of building on what other people are saying, because as we know, we think and read things differently than when we're speaking out loud. So actually it gives another dimension for people to be able to use their preferences well in that team environment. And I think there's obviously there's been lots of conversations this year about encouraging people to use their cameras. And again, we know that that can be a real struggle for people who really don't like seeing themselves or get put off by seeing, pictures, and actually, it's too much information. But it's very interesting as well that the difference it makes, particularly if you are one of those people who is trying hard to lead a conversation, to facilitate a conversation. If everyone's got their camera off and you can't see what they're up to, or any expression at all, you can feel a little bit bereft and a bit lost and think, oh, I don't even know why I'm bothering here. But actually, it makes such a difference when people come on and you just see a nod, or you see them having a cup of tea and they're there, and it feels, you can feel their presence more, can't you? But I know that's been a real struggle for people, for lots of different reasons. So, the added functionality of having different backgrounds you can have in has helped people feel like, I don't want to share necessarily my bedroom,
Yes,
if I'm sitting on the end of my bed with
exactly.
people, but I don't have a choice because that's where I'm set up. I
Yeah.
think there's been different things that the functionality has offered to that virtual environment that has helped people. But I guess one of the things that almost worries me a bit more is the real difference in preferences, particularly for new teams coming together where people don't know each other well. For those people who are trying hard and, posting or messaging or trying to get people involved in a conversation, whether it's real live like this or whether it's actually over a period of time using a chat function in a group, is some of those people who sit back because they may be more nervous to contribute and don't want to be in that kind of conversation, but other people feeling, judged or observed by people who don't want to be involved. And how do we include everyone in a way that feels good for them?
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I think it's about, because that, I think as well, there's all these functions and features, isn't there? Like you can blur your background, or you can change your background, and that I do feel like that's been a learning curve for people, and potentially those of us who are more used to tech platforms just assume that people know that function is available.
Yeah.
So I think part of it as well is just not assuming anything about anyone. So someone might be sitting in their bedroom and feeling embarrassed because they haven't got a home office or they haven't got a dedicated workspace. But actually it's about sort of just being open and saying, did you know that you can blur your background, and would you mind turning your camera on, and potentially even giving people a bit of advance notice and saying, because I'm really conscious of it as well, a lot of training, I noticed in the first lockdown everyone had their cameras on, and what I've noticed now is that people are much more comfortable to leave their cameras off. And I mean, I'm human as well, and I do like feedback when I'm training. I like to know that people are engaged, that people are listening, and it's I think I sort of find it a struggle to. I don't want to force people to turn their cameras on because I want to respect people's privacy as well, and respect their well-being. But equally, I know that there's so much more value out of the engagement when people do turn their cameras on. So I think it's about having those conversations up front and co-creating, those solutions, and not assuming anything. So really, and as a coach, I always sort of will say this, it's about really just having those conversations with people where you say, what would make you feel comfortable to do that? How can we co-create this platform and make it work well for everybody? Because I had a session the other day with someone who's neurodiverse, and I was feeling a bit strained from having my video on all the time, and I said, "Oh, do you mind if we have a phone conversation?" And I completely overlooked the fact this person said, "Actually, do you mind if we have video? Because otherwise I get distracted. I really need to see who I'm talking to." So it's little things like that, but it was really great that we were able to just have that conversation, and we were able to then reach middle ground and negotiate on how we interact with each other. So I think that's really important, is just co-creating and not assuming that everybody knows or that each other's needs and preferences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that, because what you're expressing there also is an openness and an honesty that we do need to be explicit about our needs, because you can't guess. We can't possibly, assume that we know how that, but perhaps we can ask those questions up front of like, what works well for you? I don't want to make the assumption that this is exactly how we set it up, but also that preparedness, exactly as you said, giving people an understanding beforehand. That's something I struggle with, because I'm very spontaneous. So I often think, oh gosh, sorry, I haven't given you any time to prep, but can we try this? And I think people, there's a lot of people that brings a lot of anxiety. They want to know what they're doing beforehand. They want to be prepared and feel that they're able to be in their comfort zone. And that's not always going to be possible either, though, is it? We all have to be able to push ourselves a little bit and try to go beyond our comfort zone, and sometimes surprise ourselves massively. It's I've noticed as well. I've noticed bravery in some people in my experience in the last year, particularly people of other generations who literally threw themselves into tech in a way I never could have imagined. People who'd retired and absolutely got stuck in and said, well, I'm just going to make the best out of this situation and learn how to use Zoom. And they were changing backgrounds and putting wigs on and all kinds of things. But yeah. I was amazed that they were so brave to just try. And it made me think, actually, that was really endearing. And lots of people doing similar things with just, similarly gifts as well. So when I first came to, when the pandemic hit, I hadn't been using gifts very much, and some, other people had. I don't know if it's just a generational thing or not, but the amount of emotion that you can get from sending a GIF versus sending a comment was so powerful. I was blown away. And we were almost as a team on some occasions when it was very stressful, particularly, to break that stress with some humor. We were having GIF conversations, that were quite long. And it was like, my goodness, this is so powerful and so meaningful, because they were able to express themselves. And I was actually really blown away that was brought into lots of different platforms.
Yeah, exactly. And it's about being a bit more creative as well, isn't it? I think I love the GIFs. I think they do add so much color and flavor to a conversation. I think there's sort of the next step up from emojis as well. And emojis as well, I think are really great in virtual conversation, because otherwise it's almost like when you send an email, it can feel so flat, can't it? And I think there's so much room for misinterpretation in emails, because you can't get the emotions across. So I think it's so important to be able to get that human connection. That's what we're looking for at the end of the day. And we're really relying on virtual to replace that face-to-face interaction. But I guess the other thing as well is just having that growth mindset. So as you said, the older generation, even my mum started doing FaceTimes and WhatsApp video calls, which she never would have done before the pandemic. But it's just really nice to see people having that growth mindset about technology and actually just sort of embracing it and thinking, I can take on a new platform. I can learn how to use it. and being a bit brave, as you say, and putting themselves out of their comfort zone a little. So
Mm.
I think that's been the nice thing to observe as we've gone through. Is
Yeah. And it becoming the norm in the work environment. And I think that's where, as you said, you brought it back to that human point of like humanizing work, is that, you know, GIFs and emojis and more light-hearted chat stuff is actually part of our human fabric. And
yeah,
bringing
yeah,
that into what is seen as a professional environment and
yes,
saying
yeah.
that's okay, actually, I think is so powerful for leaders to do it in the right way. Um, and
Mm.
you can almost, as I said, it's endearing. You can almost forgive people when it's so obvious that they're just trying to have a positive influence, that it doesn't matter if they get it slightly wrong, because it's, as I said, it's more, it can be more funny, and it's accepting and creating that psychological safety that, gosh, I can do this. We all make mistakes. We're all human, and it's okay. Let's
That's
use this in the way that helps bring, I guess, some relief, some comfort, some connection, some humanity back into what has been a very challenging time and still continues to be for so many people. And I wonder how much that will stay in the work environment.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because what I've really observed and noticed is with people's videos. So even on the BBC News, we're just seeing people's living rooms and kitchens, and
Mm,
so we're seeing people speaking very unpolished. They haven't had professional makeup done, they haven't had necessarily media training or anything like that. So we're seeing people speaking in more authentic, natural ways, I think, and I think that's really had an impact on what we normalize, what we see. So if you recall the BBC News clip where that expert and his kids kind of just marched into the room, and it was hilarious. I absolutely resonated with it when it came out. It was pre-pandemic. My son was quite young at the time, and I'm sure he did that to me, and he just marched into my room and sort of just crashed one of my coaching sessions, and I was absolutely mortified and completely embarrassed. And then it's really interesting to see how that attitude has shifted since the pandemic, because it's just normal now for cats to walk across keyboards and for dogs to be barking, or kids to sort of barge in with a picture that they've just done because they want to show everyone on a Teams call. And it's actually quite nice. It's quite nice that that we can be a bit more human, even in a work context. Whereas I think before the pandemic, that was viewed slightly differently. And certainly my reaction was I was much more mortified when it happened before the pandemic. Whereas now, I think everyone's a bit more forgiving, and actually it's quite nice, isn't it? It's quite nice to see people's pets and children, and you feel a bit more of a human connection with someone.
mm. Yeah, so hopefully it will simply add to the wonderful mix we already have kind of forming in workplaces. People are doing better, leaders are doing better, teams are doing better now, and what can we do to really enhance and shape that for what's going to happen next? There's going to be lots more people returning to offices. There's going to be much more movement happening, and not just in England, obviously across the world. And it's really thinking about how do we make sure that we keep the essence of that going, because we know in hybrid teams where some people are in the office and some people are dialing in from home into a meeting, it's okay if everyone's on their own equal screen.
Yes.
But I
Yeah.
felt it myself when I dial in and I'm the only one dialing in to a room full of people.
Yeah.
I instantly have to wait for the space to speak, because it's not as easy, because you're not
Right.
as equal as everyone dialing in. And that is going to be almost like another hurdle challenge, isn't it? Of like, how do we help make sure people feel they have the space to talk, to be involved? Not all offices have the brilliant technological capability to bring all the chat and everything up on screen whilst people are in a room. So how are we going to manage it? Is everyone going to be sat at their desks, all having to mute separately because they can overhear all the conversations? Technologically, it's quite challenging.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think that's the conversations we're starting to have now with people in the workplace is that managing hybrid teams, and also managing people who have joined during lockdown. So there might be teams who have worked together for years before the pandemic, and then new members who have come on who they've only got to know in a virtual sense. So there's an imbalance there already. And how do you then bring those people in and create a bit more of a balance in terms of how they're interacting and connecting with the team? So yeah, look, I think different kinds of challenges will start to emerge as we go into this kind of next phase of working. That hybrid becomes more common.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to what you said previously in terms of kind of practical hints and tips around preparedness. You know, if we know that two people are going to be dialing in to a meeting where everyone's in the room, considering beforehand, letting them know what we're going to be talking about, making sure there's agendas. I mean, this is kind of general meeting etiquette anyway, but maybe it just helps us pull our socks up and say, right, we need to actually put this in place now for everyone. And making sure that, you know, someone is chairing the meeting potentially, even if it's informal, and just say, can you kind of just chair it and make sure everyone's got an equal opportunity to talk and bring people in at the right points, and so that people are genuinely included, as you say, because that's easy. That's not hard. And it is a challenge. So if we just simply remember to focus our attention on the sense of inclusion that we can create, even in hybrid environments, and how we can work. We're so creative, as you said, you know, we can be really innovative in how we get around these challenges. And as humans, we know what matters.
Yeah, and I think it is. It's about sort of allowing yourself to make mistakes as well. You might get it wrong the first time you do it, but then have a chat about it and say, okay, what might work better next time? And I've had that experience of being the only one on a virtual in a face-to-face meeting, and just reflecting on it, it was like, actually, if I had a spokesperson there or an advocate for me there who would actually say, Tia's got something to say. Can everyone just be quiet a second? And then, that would be really helpful. Or having a big screen, if there's the functionality there, to put my face up on a big screen. I know that's, it might be intimidating for some people, but at least people then remember that I'm there and I'm not just a little face on a smart screen. So it's just exploring, isn't it? I think exploring with people and co-creating solutions.
That's it, and making sure that we place importance on it. And as you said before, if new people are coming into the team and people haven't met them before, just preparing in advance, maybe asking everyone up front to share a couple of their strengths, so that you're giving people a context to get to know each other. Because without platforms, whether they be literal technical platforms or just simply platforms for good conversation, we're actually at a loss, aren't we? We're not going to be able to always interrupt. And we know hierarchies and different team dynamics mean that it makes it even harder. There's so many barriers, but we can be creative around how we help people with that and bring people together. And we know that cohesion is absolutely critical for a team. You know, we are not all just independent contributors, all working on our own independent projects. They are interconnected, which is why we have teams and organizations. And focusing on that means that we have to place importance on it. So, we're very much at the end of our discussion here. I told you it would go quickly, and it's gone super quick today.
It has.
A fascinating conversation, and I've loved talking to you about this topic. It's something that's very dear to me, and I've loved hearing your expertise. You're working, as a practitioner every day, having these conversations. And as I said, so many of the people that have contributed over these last few live sessions, we don't get a chance to reflect and write it all down and do research projects on it, because we're doing it. We're out there.
Exactly.
And so thank you so much for sharing your experience and what you've been working on, and the research that you've read recently. It's been very valuable. I'm sure it has to our viewers and our listeners who are either watching live or watching the recording. So I look forward to continuing our conversations on it anyway, Tia. And there's some comments here we can respond to afterwards. So thank you everyone who's been involved, who's been listening. Really enjoyed the comments that have come through, and really looking forward to our last of this series live sessions tomorrow. We're going to be talking about, we've had relationships, platforms. And tomorrow we're going to be talking about powerful communication. Just have to remember there. I've got Helen Day and Beth McManus joining me tomorrow. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation. I hope you can all join us. And have a great rest of your day, Tia. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome. And thanks everyone for listening as well. It's been great to chat.